Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. This is now our last video in the series of Module 4 videos dealing with the topic of global business. So this is where we sort of wrap things up. And as you can see here, we finish up here with our continuing discussion of trade barriers here in this lecture 8. And just as a point of review, you know that in the last lecture, in lecture 7, we were talking about potential cultural differences as complexities or even barriers to free communication and trust, building trust for the sake of international trade. Well, in that video we mentioned there are two other classifications of potential trade barriers, the first being economic tools and the second being political or legal tools used as barriers to trade. We'll talk about that now, how that works itself out. And in reality, what you see, one of the barriers that's sometimes put in place to international trade from an economic perspective are to establish either quotas or even a complete embargo on another nation importing or exporting particular goods or services. So you see what a quota is. A quota is a numerical restriction. A quota says you may only import this many units of this product into our country. Restriction on the number of products of a certain type that can be imported. We have seen quotas here in the United States back in the 70s. Quotas were placed on Japanese auto manufacturers, limiting the number of cars that they could import into the United States in any 12-month calendar year. And that, of course, was put in place to provide support to American automakers, to protect American automakers who were having their lunch eaten by, quite frankly, better products that were more resonant with a consumer who was very, very conscious about the price of gas, and therefore they wanted smaller cars that used less gas. American automakers were completely tone deaf and refused to offer those kinds of vehicles into the marketplace in any way whatsoever until the Japanese started gaining market share because they were more than happy to build smaller cars with smaller engines and import them in the United States. And that the reason why we have an embargo right under the term quota, you see what an embargo is. An embargo is a government order banning completely the importation of a particular product or an exportation to a particular country. In other words, you can think of an embargo as a quota of zero, right? A complete limitation rather than a numerical restriction. It's a quota of zero. You may not import any goods from this country, or in America, in the United States case, well, you will not export any goods into a country like Cuba. We've had a long-standing curtailment, a complete embargo on economic activity between the two countries for a long time, since the 60s, right? And so that's one way of dealing with international trade, is to either put limits or a complete ban on import or export activity. That's certainly a pretty heavy-handed but an effective way to put the brakes on international trade. We continue with tariffs and subsidies, and these are purely economic ways of dealing with international trade. What is a tariff? A tariff is you tax an import at the port. When it arrives on your shores and is at the loading dock, you levy a tax, an economic financial tax on those products. And of course, what's the end result if you're taxing a product when it arrives on your shores? Typically what it means is that the seller, the company from another country, the seller has to pass that cost on to the domestic consumer. And so if a pack of cigarettes in Japan, for instance, typically costs $5, but you put a $5 tax on top of it, then the exporter has really no choice but to increase the price of that pack of cigarettes to at least $10 in order to at least pay the tax off, right? And so this is actually what's happened in Japan with American cigarettes, because there are Japanese tobacco manufacturers as well that the Japanese government would like to protect. What they can't really change, however, is that the Japanese tobacco consumer loves the myth of the Marlboro Man and loves Marlboro cigarettes. And so despite the heavy tariffs placed on Marlboro cigarettes in Japan, still Japanese consumers still want to smoke Marlboros because they are just in love with the myth of that, that tall, skinny cowboy kind of a thing. On the other side of a tariff, rather than levying a tax on imported products, sometimes what governments do is they provide funding, a subsidy, to domestic businesses in order to allow them to compete. And if you think about it economically, it's really just the flip side of the same coin, right? In order to help domestic businesses compete on a quote-unquote level playing field, then you can either increase the cost of the imported product, or you can decrease the effective cost of domestic production, which is what a subsidy does, right? The government pays a domestic business some sort of a sum to defray costs to quote-unquote level the playing field and allow them to compete with cheaper priced imported products. Now, we have seen this recently in a lot of different ways. One of the more long-standing subsidies, of course, is in the American agricultural domain, where, for instance, the U.S. government has provided billions of dollars of subsidies to the American corn production industry. And that's why we have corn in everything, right? Now we have corn syrup as sugar. We use corn fiber in our clothing. We feed our livestock corn, our chickens and our pigs and our cows. And when we run out of corn, sometimes we still have too much leftover corn because corn producers are producing effectively below cost. And so rather than flood the market with corn, we just simply throw it away. That is the long-term effect of unchecked subsidies from the government. But it is an effective way to give your domestic producers the upper hand, economically speaking, over the intrusion of imported competitors. And that's a good way to segue into this next slide. The whole idea of protectionism is the practice of protecting your domestic businesses from foreign competition. And you end up protecting them one way or another, whether by setting numerical quotas or giving economic subsidies or placing economic taxes on imported goods. But the whole point is it protects domestic producers at the expense of, theoretically, completely free market competition, right? Because completely free market competition, at least in theory, says, hey, let everybody compete and may the best product win, right? The product that is the most satisfactory to the marketplace, brought at the most efficiency at therefore the lowest effective cost, and therefore they command the highest profit, and over the long haul the market will decide who the winner is. Well, in theory, right? In theory, the free market advocate would say there are always winners and losers in the free market, and we're willing to live with the results. Well, that only goes so far, because many times governments will step in and say, well, yeah, we appreciate the free market system, but we are simply unwilling to live in a reality where our domestic businesses go out of business. Therefore, we're going to protect them. And that is the whole concept, the pro side of the argument for protectionism. The argument against protectionism basically charges, as you can see there in the second bullet point, the critics charge that eventually in the long term, all that ends up happening is that protectionism drives up prices, and so as a result we as consumers end up paying higher prices across the board, and it reduces competition and choices, and therefore it sets up situations closer to oligopolies or even pure monopolies, which work only in the favor of the producer over the long run and not the consumer. In other words, the primary charge against protectionism suggests that protectionist policies, when a government protects domestic businesses, what it ends up resulting in is it harms the consumer. Now, there are other forms of trade barriers. These are not so much economic as legal, as you can see from the top of the slide there. There can be restrictions placed, for instance, on the amount or the percentage of content in that particular product, whether it's made domestically or made internationally. And so in some ways that many governments around the world institute trade barriers is they put in place a local content law that says, hey, you're free to import the half-assembled product or some of the factors of production, but at least 50% of that end product has to be made in this country or contain components from our country in order for you to sell it here. And that's what's known as as you can see there, a local content law. There's also business practice law or regulations which govern how business practice is placed in particular countries. There are sometimes producers who organize into a cartel in order to control prices and the amount of supply. Remember the theory of supply and demand all the way back from our first module. It simply argues if you want to keep prices high, then from a supplier perspective, what would you do? You would restrict the quantity in the marketplace, which is exactly what OPEC does in the world, the cartel of oil producing countries. They gather and meet and agree upon restricting the amount of petroleum sold in the world at any particular point in time in order to keep prices artificially high. The flip side of that is dumping. You see the last point there, the practice of selling a product abroad for less than the cost of production. Why would you sell anything for less than your cost? Well, if you sell something less than cost and clearly lower than any of your competitors, what do you end up doing over the long haul? Well, over the long haul, everybody will end up buying from you. Therefore, you gain market share. And eventually, if you gain enough market share, other competitors are forced to go out of business, which means you get close to a monopoly in a particular industry. Then what do? Then you can jack your prices up wherever you want because you're the only game in town. Well, as you can tell from our discussion here, this is complex stuff. There's no right and wrong answers really when you talk about this, because quite frankly, if you are the citizen of a particular country, you know what it feels like to say, hey, I think at the end of the day, our domestic companies should be in existence and we should be able to produce this stuff. Okay, we're not nearly as efficient as Japan or the United States or Germany, but we should still be able to produce it and we shouldn't be put out of business by international trade. Therefore, there always will be an argument for some level of government intervention and protectionism in most international trade, in most global business. The question, of course, is not if, it's how much. To what degree is protectionism a good thing for a national economy, and in which and what percentage does it need to get to until it crosses the line and there becomes a thing that hurts consumers at the end of the day? Where's the balance there? And that is difficult. But as you think you can see just from this survey in this module, global business is, at the end of the day, just business, but business with a great number of layers of complexity, everything ranging from selling into marketplaces with consumers that come from a different culture than you do, to having to deal with foreign currency exchange, to having to deal with a government that may have different understandings of protectionist trade policy than what you're used to. All of these kinds of things make global business, on the one hand, possibly ripe with opportunity to earn higher than normal economic profit for a firm, and also replete with all sorts of added layers of challenges and complexities once you start trying to sell or buy stuff across the border of your own country. I hope that helps. As always, there's more content in the textbook. Hope this is helpful. We'll see you in the next module.